Do you think that there is, like, what would it take to turn around, like, to turn the discussion, to turn around where we are now to where we need to be?
Well, typically what's happened in our history is it's taken some cataclysmic event like a 9/11 or December 7th. Uh, I don't want to see that, but that's been our history. But now the difference is maybe it's different. I don't know. I mean, I talked to people that were alive that served in World War II that I knew growing up and while I was in the Navy still. Uh, and things are in some ways bad, but even before World War II, we were preparing, not like we should have been, but there were people that were preparing. And I think the same is happening today in certain circles in the Defense Department. People are trying to prepare under the auspices and the environment that we're working under. But we should be intelligent enough to say we don't have to have another 9/11 or a 7 December to go through this. That's the goal. That should be our goal. But it seems like humans, we're not wired that way. We're not really as Americans especially, we're not a belligerent nation. We react when we're struck, but we don't really seek out to go do these things.
So one of the threats, potentially a distracting threat on the near horizon, is Russia and their troop buildup on the Ukrainian border. How does that affect the U.S. military's priority with respect to China?
Well, I know there's a lot of good folks out there that have cautioned about, putting too much emphasis on Russia. And my feeling is if we don't show a hard line to Putin in Russia and on the Ukrainian situation, if we don't, show some deterrence there, that's going to be interpreted by Xi and the Communist Party, and it'll be measured in their scientific development as they go through and they rack and stack American capabilities, American intentions. Okay, so they didn't react here. We saw what they did in Kabul. Now let's see what they do in Ukraine. Okay, maybe it's time to go to Taiwan because we have this, data that we've been able to register. Here's what the Secretary of State said. Here's what the Secretary of Defense said. Here's what the Vice President said at the Munich conference coming up. They'll digest all this stuff and they'll feed it into their what they call comprehensive national power and scientific development, and they'll figure out whether or not it's a right time to invade Taiwan or not. It'll be a factor. So that's pretty obvious. But on the other hand, they'll also factor in what are we doing militarily? What are our militaries doing? What is the NATO military doing? And how could that be used against them or not used against them? Or how does the United States respond to if Putin moves, some division here, some battalion there? Do we respond to that? We won't see that in the press, but they'll see that through other sources, and that'll go into their calculations as well.
Well, I think it's interesting. You're kind of mentioning like the focus of the U.S. as in terms of war fighting capabilities, because another one of the common criticisms of the Chinese military is low morale. People sometimes say, the one-child policy also cripples their military. What do you think about that? Is that accurate? Is low morale and the one-child policy making the Chinese military not a threat? How much of an impact does that actually have?
You hear this argument, and we heard it after the big earthquake, I think in 2008, where family members were upset that the government hadn't done more to protect their children at the schools with the proper construction and things of that nature. So yes, having a one-child society makes people hypersensitive to the safety of their one child. But as we also have seen, and it was in your show, it talked about the fact that, they recruit and do annual recruiting drives, and they bring in conscripts twice a year. They bring in 400,000 people. So we don't hear or see the impact of people being so disgruntled that they can't volunteer to serve in the military. Sure, in the elite circles of Chinese society or PRC society, there are certainly people that would look down upon a career in the military, just like in America. Nobody at Harvard or the Ivy League would want to serve in the military. That's looked down and frowned upon as, being below the elite status. But for the rank and file of Chinese, maybe if you're from the central China or eastern China or western China, you're going to have an opportunity to get out of the muck and mire of where you're at, or some dead end, job that's, what was that, 996, where you're working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, putting together toys for, America or Europe. So you're like, well, I think I'll go volunteer to go be in the military. So I think I don't see that. I don't see it. Maybe it's there psychologically, societally, but I don't see it in the recruiting numbers. I don't see it in the operations. I don't see it in the any other sources that suggest that people are dissatisfied with being in the military. Now, on the other hand, if there probably is some sporadic evidence of that. And, people complain in every military. We used to have a saying in the Navy, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but it used to say, a bitching sailor is a happy sailor. So if you're whining and complaining about being in the service, that's just kind of par for the course. But I don't even see that from the Chinese. Now, they suppress kind of dissent and things of that nature. But in terms of numbers and what we see their operations, I don't see an impact from it, at least not in the PLA Navy and the PLA Air Force. And I frankly, I don't see it in the PLA Army either.
Well, Jim, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing these thoughts that really are not out there nearly enough about the threat of the Chinese Communist Party and the military in particular. Well,
thanks so much for the opportunity. I mean, they're not 10 feet tall. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm not a defeatist. What I'm saying is that I think a realist, which is to say they're a serious threat and we need to take that seriously and we need to start defending ourselves. And that means taking the force head on and to recognize that, at least for the near term, naval warfare is very important for our nation. And we need to get back to being a naval power and being able to blunt the Taiwan invasion. And if we were able to do that, imagine the impact that would have on Xi and the party. If they had their hands blunted, if they try to creep into Taiwan and we broke their fingers, that would have a dramatic impact on the regime survivability. So it's more than just a force on force thing, which it really is most important, but that piece of it would really have a strategic impact.
Amen to that. Thanks again, Joe. Amen to that. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Thank you all. Have a good night.
I was thinking about what Jim was saying about how historically it's taken some disaster like 9/11 or the Pearl Harbor attack to kind of snap America into like, oh, wait, this is a threat.
Yeah, Churchill said, America is a country that will always do the right thing after exhausting every other option.
Well, I was thinking that COVID could have been that threat.
But it wasn't.
And it wasn't because we were complicit in that. Do you know what I mean? Like a genius thing that the Chinese Communist Party has done is by getting U.S. businesses and institutions and officials and academics involved in a lot of different aspects of what they're doing. Is that, for example, when people started talking about how a lab leak could have caused the coronavirus to spread, then you had these scientists who came out and were like, no, that's a conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. That is, impugning the good name of Chinese scientists. We can't let that stand. And then they basically started to use the media to squash it. And that is because they were involved, right? Peter Daszak from the Eco Health Alliance, he was involved. A lot of research, a lot of scientists who do this kind of research were like, oh, if this happened, then our entire research field is gone, right? The idea that you should make viruses more dangerous in order to prevent a pandemic.
See, I don't think it would have been so bad if it weren't for American scientists working with Chinese labs, as it happened for many years. That, if American scientists were only working in America or, in Europe, friendly liberal democracies, like it wouldn't have been a problem for them to criticize it because they could still say, oh, well, how we do things here is safe. It was the China stuff that was wrong. And it's even worse than that, though, because, the New York Times loses their bureau. The Wall Street Journal loses their bureau. NBC loses their Olympics broadcasting contract. All these threats that the Communist Party is able to hold over us. And they may not even have to say them. They're not going to be like, oh, well, if you say this, then we're going to do this. It's way vaguer than that. Like, it's just this kind of general fear of losing access to that market or having other consequences that are.
or they'll do something like what they did to Australia or Lithuania, and then you have a concrete example. Or they kick out some New York Times reporters.
Right.
Or, so they'll do things so that you'll know what they'll do to you.
Kill the chicken to scare the monkeys.
Yeah.
Well, part of the problem is like what Jim was saying is like, we don't recognize the threat of the Chinese Communist Party. For most of COVID, it was more, the media was mostly focusing on like left-right political issues in the U.S. It's, people protesting lockdowns or far-right white supremacists. Like the real threat, that's the real threat.
Well, I think part of that is because actually in the beginning, like we had a huge bump in subscribers when COVID started because people were concerned and they kind of started realizing that we should pay attention to China.
Mm-hmm.
But because of like all of the vested interests that we have, because of the World Health Organization has, been bought off because
politicians, media.
Yeah. Like, so then that part of it could not be talked about. Like it took more than a year before suddenly people were allowed to say, like before some science writers and journalists started publishing things that people were actually like, oh, wait. Because people had been talking about that before, but they were not like, okay, they're not credible enough to be listened to, et cetera, et cetera. And then, YouTube would yank your, channel or your videos.
I mean, it's still going on.
Yeah.
We just had an episode removed on China Unscripted for medical misinformation, an interview we did with Lori Garrett, who, worked with the Council on Foreign Relations. She's an expert on...
She's a Pulitzer Prize winning science writer. But, now it's like, I don't even know. I wonder if somebody reported it for some reason. Because
it's really strange.
That was from February 2020. So like the argument that people are being medically misinformed by something that nobody is going to go back to February 2020 and be like, well, how should I, treat COVID? Yeah. So, because we didn't know a lot of stuff. It
wasn't even called COVID. It was called the Wuhan virus back then, according to Chinese state media.
Well,
no, they stopped that in January, to be fair.
But I think,
it was such a different era. And in February 2020, there was no idea in America, except in a very, very small group of people, that this was going to be a thing that was going to cause a problem in the U.S.
I do remember talking about masks being unnecessary or something like that, because that is what the guidance was at the time. Yeah. So it was just that is kind of absurd.
Mm-hmm.
But, up until the summer of 2021, you couldn't, if you talked about a lab leak being the cause of the the pandemic, then you were going to get strikes on your channel. Right.
Even as a hypothesis, I can't even get that word out. Hypothesis.
Yeah.
Right. We still don't know what the truth is. It's still this is a hypothesis that has more strength than the natural origin hypothesis.
Well, so Shelley, the point you were making is the idea that America needed a bloody nose and that COVID should have been it, but it wasn't.
Because there were a lot of people who had the vested interests in keeping that quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Where was the outrage that, the Chinese Communist Party was essentially nationalizing American companies like 3M by preventing 3M from exporting masks that they were making in China to the US. It was just, well, we can't go there, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that is part of what we're talking about with Jim with the military stuff too, where China does really aggressive things. The Chinese officials, will write white papers about taking Taiwan, et cetera, the Wolf War diplomacy stuff. And then there will be people who are like, oh, well, they don't mean it.
Yeah.
We are the people who are saying, oh, not us, but Western people are saying, okay, that's not something we should take seriously.
Yeah. Which scares me, because like if COVID was not the bloody nose that it took, what will it take? Or what if it is an invasion of Taiwan and we still have the same problem of, Western experts saying, yeah, it's not a problem.
I mean, people are preemptively saying,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
And if that rules the day, if if anyone criticizing China invading Taiwan gets censored, what do we do?
I don't have a good answer to that.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, that's a horrifying thought.
I mean, this is why we talk about having to get ahead of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when Ian Easton comes on and talks about deterrence or whatever, that you have to try to, or Jim talks about, like, we have to try to get people to care now before there is a terrible thing that happens.
Yeah. The problem is just the enemies are not abroad.
I mean, they are.
They're in the house. Well, thank you for watching this episode of China Unscripted. Speaking of getting kind of future proofing, and since we just had an episode removed, we do have a China Unscripted Patreon account. I also will post our podcast episodes on our China Uncensored Locals account. So that, this is where we can future-proof ourselves.
Yeah, and of course we have our website, ChinaUnscripted.com. You can go to as well for all the episodes.
.com?
It's .com.
.com.
And as well as we have Spotify,
Stitcher,
Apple iTunes, and Stitcher as well.
So yeah, thanks for joining us. I'm glad you are being educated about these issues. Be sure to tell your friends and family, because that's what this is going to take.